Shoegaze is a music genre that's recently been taking the internet over by storm. Seemingly overnight, musicians from all over the world are taking inspiration from and creating their own shoegaze tracks in the thousands. But what is it about shoegaze that makes it so captivating? That answer is the atmospheric, unique production. In today's video, we're going to do a deep dive into the shoegaze subculture in the modern internet era and figure out what we can learn from it to make our own beats inspired by some of the most legendary shoegaze artists of the past few decades. Today's video is going to be a good one. There's so many tips and tricks that you could directly apply to your production immediately. I'm really excited to get into this, so sit back, relax, grab a snack, and let's dive into the atmospheric world of shoegaze production. When the shoegaze people look at the shoes. Shoegaze is a subgenre of indie and alternative rock production that's made unique by its abstract mix of distortion and reverb effects, feedback, and overall atmosphere that just makes you feel like you're in a dream when you're listening to it. The My Bloody Valentine album Loveless, released in 1991, is often considered to be the first ever cohesive project in the shoegaze style. The genre is heavily inspired by predecessor bands like The Cure, where you can really hear that wide reverb sound that inspired shoegaze music for years to come. Some other shoegaze bands include the likes of Slowdive, Whir, and Lush. After the late 90s, shoegaze had a bit of a dip in popularity, with the iconic bands still maintaining their core fan base, but nothing crazy happening in the scene for most of the early 2000s. During the early 2020s, shoegaze would see its most popular resurface to date due to popular social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram. With music being so accessible nowadays, a new generation of musicians took it into their own hands to make their own shoegaze-inspired tracks. Some of the more popular new gaze artists, I don't know who came up with that name, include the likes of Flying Fish, Quanic, Next Time, and Julie. You're gonna notice a common trend here, which is that the genre starts to become a lot more unique with each artist, and that the genre shoegaze starts to become a much more broad spectrum categorization for very ambient, dreamy feeling rock music. In today's video, my goal is to create a shoegaze inspired beat that perfectly encapsulates the essence of every great shoegaze band into one big conglomerate track. Let's get into it. To start our shoegaze inspired beat, I'm gonna start with the drums first. Most producers tend to start their beats with the melody, but I always find that I have an easier time recording my instruments and getting a general vibe for the track when I lay the drums down first, so that's what we're gonna do. For the drums in this video, I'm gonna be using the free MT Power Drum Kit VST. I'm gonna start by laying down a super basic snare pattern that sounds like this. To spice things up and make it a little bit less basic, I'm gonna add some extra snare hits throughout the pattern where I'm trying to emulate a drum player hitting their snare very lightly and the stick kind of like doing this, bouncing on the snare. That's gonna sound like this. After that, to solidify the rhythm for the beat, I'm gonna lay down a kick pattern to complement the snare that sounds like this. We've solidified the bounce for our track, so now I'm going to further accentuate it with some cymbals. First, I'll add a super simple hi-hat. After that, I'm gonna make things feel more impactful with a crash cymbal. But before I play it, make sure that you don't have your hi-hats and cymbals playing at the exact same time. Although it does happen sometimes, it's way less common for a real-life drum player to be hitting his cymbal and his hi-hat at the same time. Like I said, it does happen, but more typically, a real live drum player is gonna stop playing his hi-hat when he's hitting the crash. And it's definitely important when going for a shoegaze track to try to emulate a real-life drum player because, you know, real shoegaze, it's real instrument players. So make sure you guys remember that. This is what the crash and hi-hat are going to sound like together. And to finish it up, I'm going to get a real-life percussive instrument. Let me get it. Tambourine. A very slowed down version of how I play the tambourine is kind of like this. And when you speed it up, it starts to sound a bit like this. After a little bit of processing, when it's recorded into the track, the tambourine is going to sound like this. Now we could leave our drum pattern here, but there are two more key production tips for shoegaze that are going to be essential for emulating the production style. First, we have to make our drum pattern sound like they're being played by a real person. To do this, we have to vary the velocity of our drum playing, but more importantly, we have to make sure that none of the MIDI that we're playing is perfectly quantized. If you think about it in real life, even the most professional drum players, they are never going to 100% accurately play the drums on like a 4/4 time grid. We want to go for that real life drummer feel. Here's a before and after of our perfectly quantized drum track versus our slightly altered unquantized drum track. Make sure you listen carefully. To finalize our drums, we need to nail the mix. There's already a little bit of reverb on the drums because we're adding a reverb to the master of the track, but shoegaze is all about that dreamy, atmospheric feel, so we're gonna add even more. The mixing chain for the drums looks a little bit like this, with a distortion plugin to add a little bit of extra thump, a reverb with these settings, really lean into that wet feeling, as well as the size and decay, and lastly, a very unorthodox EQ that looks a little bit like this. Something that you're gonna hear in a lot of iconic shoegaze tracks is for some reason, there's not a lot of low end. Some of the tracks sound like they're being played out of phone speakers that are kind of losing a little bit of low end in the mix. And here are a few examples. Because this is so common in shoegaze, we're going to try to emulate this by removing a good portion of the low end from our drum mix, as well as a little bit of high end just to add to that lo-fi feel. Now that we did all that, our finalized drum pattern is going to sound like this. Yo, what's up guys? Really quickly before we move on with the video, if you guys have been looking to make shoegaze inspired beats like this, but you just don't know where to start and you don't have the right sounds, I just dropped my 100% free Sanguine alternative rock multi-kit. It has drum fills, drum loops, drum one-shots, guitar loops, guitar accents and phrases. This kit is absolutely loaded. Not only does it have crazy samples, but the actual loops and accents and phrases make it way easier to make beats. It sparks creativity way faster and overall makes the beat making process way easier. Honestly, it's probably one of the best free rock kits on the market, so if you guys want to check it out, it'll be the first link in the description. Also, if you're liking the video, leave a like. Now let's get back to the video. The melodies for shoegaze tracks are equally as important as the drums, if not more, so let's go ahead and lay something crazy down for our track. I'm going to start by picking out some chords that we can repeat for our beat. Typically, a shoegaze track has something between 3 to 5 chords, but for this beat, I'm only using 2 chords. The chord shapes for this beat are going to look a little bit like this, and I'm going to strum it like this. Also, to add some emotion and variation in the pattern, I'm gonna add this little pull that sounds like this. An important mixing tip for all rock-based tracks, always double track your guitars. You're gonna pan one to the right, one to the left. This is the key to landing full sounding rock mixes every single time. The mixing in shoegaze is super important. It's quintessential to the overall environment that the genre builds. The secret tip to getting that drowned out, dreamy feel is putting your reverb before your distortion. I can already tell any professional musician watching this video just lost a little bit of faith in humanity, but with shoegaze, you really have to embrace the imperfection and pursue a unique sound over anything, and adding reverb before distortion completely changes the guitar tone. Here's a guitar with distortion first and reverb after. And here's a guitar with reverb first and distortion after. Essentially, what's happening here is instead of distorting our guitar and then throwing some reverb on top of that guitar tone, we're creating a much more loud, dramatic guitar tone because we're actually distorting the reverb as well. So instead of just having a distorted guitar and adding some reverb, we are creating this lush, airy guitar. And then the distortion is not only applying to the initial guitar, but it is also applying to the reverb tail afterwards. And this is key for shoegaze mixing. The exact processing of my main guitar tone consists of reverb first first with these settings. Then we have Guitar Rig 7. This is my go-to guitar amp simulator, and if you want a free demo, I'll link it down below. And an EQ to take out some low end to leave room for the bass. Now the main guitar riff is already sounding amazing, but we need even more reverb. I think you're picking up on the trend here. A lot of reverb. To further accentuate the verb, I'm going to take a separate guitar track that's processed a little bit differently, and this guitar track is going to be used as a lead, so we aren't going to make it stereo, we aren't going to pan it left or right. This is another reason why it's important to do 2 takes of your main guitar, because then when you have things in the middle of the mix, it isn't competing with anything else and it doesn't muddy up your mix. The lead that we're going to play sounds a little bit like this. The last essential part to a great alternative rock melody is a bass line, so let's wrap everything up with just that. Processing for the bass on this track is pretty similar to the guitar, reverb, and a standard Guitar Rig amp preset. Personally, I like to make my bass mono in the track. We have our main guitars panned all the way to the left and the right. We have the lead somewhere in the middle, and then we really center and solo that bass track by making it mono. Personally, this is what works best for me. It's what I do to not muddy up the mix, but it's pretty anecdotal and it doesn't work in every single beat. So make sure to experiment, figure out what works best for you. And then the last thing that we're gonna do for the bass is gonna be pretty unorthodox, which is taking out a lot of the low end. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, a lot of shoegaze tracks for some reason really have a lacking low end, and the reason for that, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I only have some of them. So if you guys know the answer for that, you can feel free to leave a comment. But what I do know is there's definitely a lacking low end in a lot of popular shoegaze tracks. So to just kind of emulate that style, I'm going to cut out a decent amount of low end. I'm not removing it entirely, but I'm taking more out than I usually would. The bass playing for this track is super simple and it's going to sound like this. And altogether, our finished melody sounds like this. So I'm not sure why, but I absolutely hate structuring my beats. It's just something that does not compute as well as like making melodies or making a drum pattern in my brain. But unfortunately, you can't really have a shoegaze track that's just like the same guitar playing over and over again for the verses and choruses. Maybe in a trap beat you can get away with that, but for most alternative rock tracks, the chorus and the verse have very distinct differences. Let's just get that over with. First, I'm gonna replay the main guitar with a simplified mix, and it's gonna sound like this. This is going to serve as our intro. Next, I'm going to replay the main guitar chords with the main guitar processing, but this time I'm going to play it as an arpeggio for the verse. And that is going to sound like this. Also for the verse, I'm going to take our original drum pattern and I'm going to simplify it a lot so that it sounds like this. To create some movement in the track, I'm going to create a drum fill that we could play before every chorus to make everything feel more grand and anthemic. That drum fill is going to sound like this. And the very last thing that we're going to add to our track is this hi-hat diddle, I don't know what to call it, and a guitar scratch effect from my hardware toolkit. When we combine these two, it kind of sounds like the intro outtake from a live band getting ready to play their instruments and start the track, and that is going to sound like this. Now that we have our full shoegaze inspired track finished, the only thing left to do is go ahead and take a listen. I'm gonna go ahead and grab my instruments and play along. Remember, if you guys want a free alternative rock multi-kit to start making beats just like this, check out the first link in the description. Peace.